The first time I saw one of them cry, I thought it was dying. Honestly, I did. You have to understand, we're talking about a species from a Class 12 Deathworld, the kind of planet where the weather actively tries to murder you, and the local fauna considers you a light snack. So when Kira Osman sat in the corner of the observation deck with water leaking from her face, making these horrible choking sounds, my first instinct was to call medical. My second instinct was to wonder if she was about to explode. But no. Turned out humans just do that. They leak salt water when they're sad, apparently. Which is insane, by the way. What kind of evolutionary advantage does voluntary dehydration provide? None. The answer is none. But they do it anyway because humans are walking contradictions held together by spite and overconfidence. Let me back up. My name is Instructor. I'm a xenobiology instructor at the Galactic Cooperation Institute, and I've been teaching interspecies relations for the better part of 2 decades. I've handled Kryll warriors who could bench press a shuttle, Venati scholars who could calculate orbital mechanics in their sleep, and even a Horthak once, though we don't talk about that semester. But humans were new. Brand new, actually. Their planet had only been inducted into the Galactic Cooperation 3 cycles ago, and already they were everywhere. Eager, curious, disturbingly friendly, and completely, utterly unaware of how terrifying they actually were. Kira was our first human student. Quiet girl, maybe 20 standard years old, which I later learned is barely adult by their standards, but apparently old enough to send halfway across the galaxy for higher education. She had this dark hair she kept tied back, brown eyes that seemed too large for her face, and this habit of smiling at everyone she met. Even the Kryll, especially the Kryll, actually, which made them incredibly uncomfortable. She never spoke unless spoken to, always sat in the back, took her notes on an actual paper notebook like some kind of primitive, and generally seemed to be doing her absolute best to not draw attention to herself. Which, of course, meant she drew all the attention. Is it true they evolved from pursuit predators? One of my Venati students, Kolax, had asked during the first week. Yes, I'd confirmed, pulling up the holographic display of Earth's ecosystem. Humans are endurance hunters. They don't have the speed of a Kryll or the strength of a Horthak, but they can chase prey for days until it collapses from exhaustion. The class had gone silent. Even the Kryll, 3 of them that semester, all on athletic scholarships, had looked unsettled. Days? Kolax had whispered. Sometimes weeks, depending on the prey and terrain. Kira had kept her head down, scribbling in her notebook, apparently unbothered by the fact that I was essentially describing her species as relentless murder machines. When I'd called on her to confirm, she'd just shrugged. Depends on the human, she'd said softly, her voice barely audible over the environmental systems. Most of us can't run for more than a few minutes without getting tired nowadays. We invented cars and delivery services for a reason. The Kryll had visibly relaxed. See? Not so scary after all. Just another species that had gone soft with civilization. That assessment lasted exactly 3 weeks. It was Vorgan who started it. Big guy, even for a Kryll, easily 9 feet tall, with the kind of exoskeleton that could deflect small arms fire. He wasn't a bad student, just entitled. You know the type, used to being the apex predator everywhere he went, used to people moving out of his way, used to getting what he wanted, and what he wanted, apparently, was Kira's seat. Now, you have to understand the social dynamics here. In the Institute, seating arrangements are serious business. You claim a spot on day 1, that's your spot for the semester. It's an unwritten rule, respected across species, because nobody wants the chaos of musical caches with beings who might accidentally poison each other through skin contact. Kira always sat in the back left corner. Same seat. Every class, for 3 weeks straight. Until the day Vorgan decided he wanted it. I was setting up that day's lecture, Comparative Neural Architectures. Fascinating stuff when I noticed the commotion. Vorgan had physically lifted Kira's bag from the desk and dropped it on the floor. Not violently exactly, but not gently either. Just moved it, like you'd move an object that was in your way. This is my seat now, he'd announced, settling his massive frame into the chair, which, by the way, was not designed for Kryll physiology and creaked alarmingly under his weight. Kira had frozen in the doorway, her bag at her feet. I saw something flicker across her face. Anger, maybe, fear. With humans, it was hard to tell. Their emotional expressions were subtle compared to most species. "That's my seat," she'd said. Still quiet, but there was something in her voice. An edge. "Not anymore," Vorgan had replied, not even looking at her. He'd spread out his learning tablet, his forearms taking up most of the desk space. The other students had gone very, very quiet. This was going to be a problem. I could feel it in the air, the way you can feel a storm coming. But I was curious. Morbidly curious, I'll admit, about how the human would handle it. Kira had stood there for a long moment, her hands clenched at her sides. Then, without a word, she'd picked up her bag and moved to a different seat, just like that. No confrontation, no argument. She'd simply yielded. Vorgan had smirked, or done the Kryll equivalent, anyway, which involved a clicking of mandibles that sounded disturbingly like laughter. And I, fool that I was, had thought that was the end of it. The crying happened 2 weeks later. I found her in the observation deck during lunch period, just leaking. When I'd approached, concerned she was having some kind of medical emergency, she'd looked up with those 2 large eyes and tried to smile. "I'm fine," she'd said, wiping at her face with her sleeve. "Just homesick." Homesick. This tiny Deathworlder, who'd traveled light years from the only planet violent enough to produce her species, was sad because she missed it. Missed the place where the local wildlife included creatures that could crush her skull with a single bite, where the weather could kill her in minutes, where her own immune system was so aggressive it sometimes attacked her own body by mistake. "Do you want to return home?" I'd asked, genuinely confused. "No," she'd said, and laughed. Another bizarre human behavior, making sounds of joy while simultaneously leaking sadness fluids. "I just miss my mom, and my dog, and tacos. God, I'd kill for a decent taco right now." I'd had no idea what a taco was. Still don't, really. Some kind of food item, apparently important enough to mention in the same breath as her maternal parent. "Would you like to talk about it?" I'd offered, because that seemed like the appropriate response. "No, thank you." She'd stood up, wiping her face one final time. "I'll be okay. Humans are good at adapting. It's kind of our thing." And she'd smiled again, that small, brave smile that I would later learn was absolutely terrifying in its implications, and walked away. I should have paid more attention to that. To the fact that she'd said humans were good at adapting, should have remembered my own lectures about pursuit predators, about a species that had conquered their entire planet through sheer stubborn persistence. Should have remembered that quiet doesn't mean harmless. The attack happened on a Thursday. Or the equivalent time gets weird when you're coordinating between a dozen different planetary cycles. The point is, it was an ordinary day. I was in my office, grading papers and trying to figure out why Kalks thought the Venati Empire had 3 moons instead of 4. When I heard the screaming, not human screaming, I'd learn what that sounded like soon enough. And let me tell you, it's the kind of sound that makes your evolutionary ancestors wake up in your brainstem and start screaming too. No, this was Kryll screaming, which sounds like metal grinding against metal inside a wind tunnel. I'd rushed out into the corridor to find absolute chaos. Students were pressed against the walls, as far from the center of the hallway as they could get, and in the middle of it all was Vorgan, thrashing and roaring, his exoskeleton plates flared out in a threat display. Attached to his back was Kira. Let me be very clear about the size difference here. Vorgan was 9 feet of armored muscle, weighing in at around 400 pounds. Kira was maybe 5.5 feet tall, probably weighed 120 soaking wet. The size differential was absurd. Comical, even. Right up until you noticed what she was doing. She had one arm wrapped around his throat, or the nearest Kryll equivalent, the soft spot where the head segment met the thorax. Her legs were locked around his midsection, and in her free hand was something small and metallic. A pen. She was stabbing him with a pen. Not randomly, either. She was going for the joints in his exoskeleton, the weak spots where the plates met, driving the metal point in with surgical precision. Vorgan's Ishor, that's what Kryll have instead of blood, greenish stuff that stinks like copper and ammonia was leaking from a dozen wounds. Eat it off me! Vorgan roared, spinning and slamming backward into the wall. Hard. The impact would have shattered the bones of most species. Kira's head snapped back, cracking against the wall with a sound that made my stomach turn, but she didn't let go. Just tightened her grip and stabbed him again. This time catching him right in the soft tissue behind his primary shoulder joint. He screamed again and dropped, trying to roll on top of her, to use his weight to crush her. And that's when she did something I still see in my nightmares sometimes. She laughed. This small, quiet student who cried when she missed her mother, who'd yielded her seat without argument, who'd spent 2 months being the very picture of gentle compliance, laughed. This wild, breathless sound that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with rage, finally being let off its leash. I was already running toward them, but I knew with the cold certainty that comes from teaching xenobiology for 20 years, that I was already too late. Whatever Vorgan had started, Kira was going to finish. I wasn't the only one running. 2 security officers, a Venati and a Horthak, both trained in non-lethal intervention, were converging from the other end of the hall. But the hallway was packed with students, all of them frozen in that peculiar paralysis that comes from witnessing something their brains can't quite process. Vorgan managed to get one of his arms back, swinging wildly. His massive fist caught Kira in the ribs. I heard something crack even over the chaos. She grunted, just grunted, like someone had bumped into her in a crowded corridor, and switched targets, going for his eyes. The pin broke, just snapped in half, the cheap metal unable to withstand the force she was applying. For a fraction of a second, she stared at the broken instrument in her hand. Then she bit him. I want to be very clear about this. Humans have flat teeth. Pitiful little things compared to proper predator fangs. They're designed for their omnivorous diet, for tearing plants and grinding seeds and occasionally processing meat that they've already killed and cooked. But Kira Osman found the soft spot where Vorgan's neck segment met his shoulder, and she bit down like her distant ancestors had once bitten into raw flesh on the African savanna, and she did not let go. Vorgan's screaming reached a pitch I didn't know Kryll vocal cords could produce. He flailed, spun, slammed her into the wall again and again, but she held on like a terrier with a rat. Her teeth were breaking. I could see the blood, red human blood, mixing with green Kryllichor. But she didn't care. Pain didn't seem to register. Only the grip mattered. Only making him hurt. The security officers finally reached them. The Horthak, built like a tank and strong enough to restrain even a Kryll in full rage, grabbed Vorgan around the midsection. The Venati, more sensibly terrified, went for Kira. "Don't touch her," I shouted, but too late. The Venati's 3-fingered hand closed around Kira's arm. She released Vorgan immediately, spun in the Venati's grip with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible, given her injuries, and very nearly broke his wrist before her brain caught up with her body and she froze. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. Something old and terrible, a glimpse of what her species had been before civilization sanded down their edges. The thing that had let them claw their way to the top of their Deathworld's food chain, despite being slower, weaker, and more fragile than almost everything that wanted to eat them. Then it was gone, shuttered behind those 2 large eyes like someone closing blast doors. Kira went limp in the Venati's grasp, breathing hard, blood running from her nose and mouth. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice hoarse. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Medical," the Horthak barked into his comm, still restraining a thrashing Vorgan. "We need medical, now. Multiple injuries. 1 Kryll, 1 human." "I'm fine," Kira interrupted, which was objectively insane given that she was bleeding from multiple locations, and I was fairly certain I could see a bone fragment through the skin on her forearm. "You're not fine," I snapped, finally reaching them. Up close, the damage was worse. Her right eye was swelling shut. There were bruises blooming across every visible inch of skin, and when she breathed, I could hear a wheeze that suggested a punctured lung. "He started it," she said, "and God's help me," she smiled. Blood on her teeth, nose obviously broken, and she smiled. I just finished it. The medical team arrived within minutes. This was an institute facility, after all, equipped to handle everything from Kryll molting complications to Venati neural surges. They separated Vorgan and Kira immediately, loading them onto separate grav stretchers despite Vorgan's protests that he was fine, he just needed a moment. The human had caught him off guard. I followed Kira's stretcher to medical, partly out of concern for my student and partly because I needed to understand what in the infinite void had just happened. The human doctor, yes. We had one now, shipped in specifically to handle Earth origin biology, took one look at her and started swearing, creatively. In at least 3 languages, including one I didn't recognize. What happened? He demanded, his hands already moving over her injuries with practiced efficiency. His name was Dr. Victor Reeves. I remembered. Former military medic according to his file. He had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen worse than one beat-up student. Interspecies altercation, I said carefully. With what? A tank? Kryll student. Large one. Dr. Reeves froze for just a moment, his eyes moving from Kira's injuries to her face. You fought a Kryll? He took my seat, Kira mumbled. Her jaw was swelling. Talking was clearly difficult. So you stabbed him with a pen and bit him. He took my seat, she repeated, as if this explained everything, and the terrifying thing. To her, it probably did. Because I'd done my research on humans after Kira enrolled. I'd read the studies, watched the documentaries, tried to understand what made them tick. One thing kept coming up, over and over in the literature. Humans are territorial pack animals with an overdeveloped sense of fairness and a profound, almost pathological inability to let things go. You could push them. Most of the time, they'd yield. They were social creatures, after all, adapted to living in groups where constant conflict would be counterproductive. They'd bend, compromise, swallow their anger and smile and move on, right up until they couldn't anymore. And when a human decided they couldn't take it anymore, when that switch flipped from endure to enough, well, their ancestors hadn't hunted megafauna across continents by being reasonable. Broken ribs, Dr. Reeves announced, running his scanner over her torso. At least 3, punctured lung, minor. Fractured radius and ulna. Concussion, definitely. Severe contusions across. Pretty much everything. And you've got bone fragments in your teeth. Not mine, Kira said. No, definitely not yours. You're human, we don't have exoskeletons. He paused. You bit through Kryll armor? Just the soft parts. Dr. Reeves looked at me. I looked back. Neither of us quite knew what to say to that. The Kryll student, I finally asked. His injuries? Multiple penetrating wounds, all non-fatal. Significant etcher loss. Trauma to the neural cluster behind his primary shoulder joint. And I consulted my datapad, where security had already uploaded their preliminary report. Bite wounds to the neck segment that severed several minor sensory tendrils. He'll live though. Oh yes. Kryll are remarkably durable. He'll probably be out of medical before Kira is, actually. I looked at the human student, now being loaded with painkillers and bone knitters. She did all that damage to him, and he did all this to her, and somehow she's in worse shape. Pyrrhic victory, Dr. Reeves said. I'm sorry, human military term. Winning a fight but taking so much damage that it wasn't worth winning. He shook his head, adjusting the settings on the bone knitter. Though knowing humans, she probably thinks it was worth it. Was it? I asked Kira directly. She was fading now, the painkillers taking hold, her eyes unfocusing. But she managed one more of those small, terrible smiles. He won't take anyone's seat again, she murmured. Worth it. Then she was out, sliding into unconscious with the kind of ease that suggested she'd done this before. Dr. Reeves got to work, his hands steady as he began the process of putting this small, fragile Deathworlder back together. I should have left. Should have gone to deal with the administrative nightmare this was about to become. Incident reports, disciplinary hearings, angry calls from Vorgan's clan leaders demanding justice. But I found myself rooted to the spot, watching as the doctor worked. She's going to be expelled, I said quietly. Institute policy is clear on violence between students. Is it clear on self-defense? Self-defense? I pulled up the security footage on my pad. She was on his back stabbing him with a pen. That's not self-defense. Look at the timestamp. I did. Then I rewound further, past the fight, past the screaming, all the way back to the beginning of the lunch period. And there it was, so quick I'd almost missed it. Vorgan approaching Kira in the cafeteria. Kira trying to walk away. Vorgan grabbing her arm, hard enough to leave bruises that would show up in her medical scan. Kira pulling free. Vorgan following her into the hallway, his body language aggressive, dominant, designed to intimidate, and Kira backing up, hands raised, clearly trying to de-escalate right up until Vorgan shoved her into the wall. That's when she'd exploded. That's when quiet, careful Kira had become something else entirely. He cornered a predator, Dr. Reeves said softly. Probably didn't even realize that's what he was doing. She looks harmless, after all. Small, quiet, always yielding. Easy prey. She's not prey. No, he agreed. She's really not. None of us are. We're just very good at pretending to be civilized. He finished setting the bone knitter and moved on to treating her facial injuries. You want to know the scary part? She held back. That was holding back. She didn't go for his eyes until the pen broke. Didn't aim for any of the kill spots humans instinctively know. Didn't try to crush his throat, didn't try to snap his neck. She was just trying to make him stop, to make it hurt enough that he'd leave her alone. Dr. Reeves met my eyes. If she'd actually been trying to kill him, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. The hearing took place 3 days later. Kira was still in medical, but conscious. Dr. Reeves had cleared her for testimony via HoloLink. Vorgan was already out. Kryll healing factors really are remarkable, and sat across the chamber looking aggrieved and confused. The disciplinary panel consisted of 3 senior faculty members. A Venati ethicist, a Kryll diplomat, myself, representing xenobiology. We'd watched the security footage a dozen times, read the medical reports, interviewed witnesses. The facts were clear. The resolution was not. The human initiated the physical violence, the Kryll diplomat said, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. That much is indisputable. After being physically cornered and assaulted, the Venati ethicist countered, by a being more than twice her size and mass. A push is not assault. It is under Terran law, and Institute policy for that matter. They went back and forth like this for an hour. Vorgan insisted he'd been joking around, that he hadn't meant to scare her, that her response was completely disproportionate. Kira, appearing as a hologram from her medical bed, said nothing in her own defense, just sat there, her face still swollen and bruised, and waited. Do you have anything to say for yourself? I finally asked her. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm sorry I lost control. It won't happen again. That's not what I asked. I know. She met my eyes, well, my holo projection's eyes. But it's all I have to say. In the end, we compromised. Vorgan was found at fault for the initial assault, suspended for 1 semester, and required to attend interspecies sensitivity training. Kira was found at fault for excessive force in response, given a formal reprimand, and assigned to anger management counseling with Dr. Reeves. Neither of them was expelled. The Kryll diplomat voted to expel Kira. The Venati ethicist voted to expel Vorgan. I was the tiebreaker, and I couldn't bring myself to end either of their academic careers over what was, ultimately, a fight between students that both walked away from. Well, limped away from in Kira's case. The semester continued. Vorgan returned to class, notably quieter, sitting in the front row now and never ever looking at the back left corner. Kira returned 2 weeks later, still moving carefully, still sitting in her seat, the seat Vorgan had vacated the day she got out of medical. Nobody took it while she was gone. Nobody even came close. The other students treated her differently now. Not with fear exactly, but with a wary respect. Like they'd suddenly realized that the hierarchy they'd assumed, big species at the top, small species at the bottom, was perhaps not as fixed as they'd thought. And me? I updated my lecture materials, added a new section on humanity, right after the part about them being persistence predators. Humans, I now tell my students, are perhaps the most dangerous species to underestimate in the known galaxy. Not because they're the strongest, they're not. Not because they're the fastest or the smartest or the most naturally armed, but because they have something most species lack: the ability to decide that enough is enough. The capacity to say no more and mean it. Consequences be damned. I usually pause there, let it sink in. And if you ever find yourself facing a human who's reached that point, who's gone from yielding to fighting, remember this: they come from a death world where everything wanted to kill them, and they survived anyway. They are soft and fragile and bleed so easily, but they do not break, they do not quit. They will chase you for days or stand their ground for hours or cling to your back with broken bones and keep fighting, because that's what evolution taught them to do. Another pause. Longer this time. So if a human says they're fine, if they smile and step aside and let you have what you want, understand that they're not weak, they're not prey, they're choosing peace. And if you're smart, you'll let them keep choosing it. Because the alternative, I always end the lecture there. Let them imagine. Let them remember the security footage they've all seen by now, spreading through the student population like wildfire. The quiet human student and the Kryll who learned what happens when you mistake courtesy for cowardice. Kira graduated 2 years later, top of her class in xenobiology. She's working for the diplomatic corps now, specializing in first contact scenarios, teaching other species about humans, about Earth, about how to coexist with Deathworlders who've learned to keep their teeth sheathed. I got a message from her last month, actually. Just a short note thanking me for not expelling her, for giving her a second chance. At the end, she'd added, P.S. Still miss tacos, though. Some things never change. And despite everything, or maybe because of everything, I found myself laughing. Humans. Absolutely terrifying, completely insane, and somehow, against all odds, the best thing to happen to the galaxy in 1,000 cycles. Just, maybe don't take their seat.